What if everything you thought you knew about one of history's greatest last stands was a lie? What if the most celebrated act of courage in Western civilization was actually built on the erasure of hundreds of forgotten heroes? For over 2 millennia, the world has been mesmerized by a single number: 300. 300 Spartans who stood against impossible odds. 300 warriors who chose death over surrender. 300 men who became legends. But here's what Hollywood didn't tell you. Here's what your history books conveniently forgot. Here's the truth that would shatter the most powerful military myth ever created. The 300 were never alone. August 480 BC, the sun rises over a narrow mountain pass in central Greece. The air is thick with morning mist and the scent of wild thyme. But something else hangs in the atmosphere. Something darker. The metallic taste of impending doom. This place has a name that would echo through eternity. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a bottleneck of rock and sea where the fate of Western civilization would be decided in just 3 days of unimaginable violence. But as we stand here today, looking across this deceptively peaceful landscape, we must ask ourselves a disturbing question. How did one of history's most documented battles become one of its most misunderstood? How did the sacrifice of over 1,000 men become the story of just 300? And more importantly, who benefited from this lie? To understand the magnitude of this deception, we must first journey back to a world on the edge of apocalypse. The year is 481 BCE. The Persian Empire, the largest the world has ever seen, stretches from India to Egypt. Its king, Xerxes, commands resources that dwarf entire Greek city-states. But Xerxes wants more. He wants revenge. 10 years earlier, his father Darius had suffered a humiliating defeat at Marathon, where outnumbered Greeks had shattered the myth of Persian invincibility. Now, the son would finish what the father had started. The numbers are staggering. Ancient sources speak of millions of soldiers, though modern historians estimate Xerxes brought between 120,000 to 300,000 warriors across the Hellespont. Either way, it was the largest invasion force the Mediterranean world had ever seen. Picture this: a human tide of Persians, Medes, Assyrians, Indians, Arabians, and dozens of other subject peoples. The earth trembled beneath their feet. The sky darkened with their arrows. Rivers ran dry as they drank. This wasn't just an army, it was a force of nature. And standing in their path, a collection of small, squabbling Greek city-states who had spent more time fighting each other than any common enemy. The odds weren't just overwhelming, they were mathematically impossible. But sometimes, the impossible becomes inevitable. In the spring of 480 BCE, as Persian scouts began mapping the roads to Athens, the Greeks faced a terrifying choice: submit to Persian rule or unite in what would almost certainly be a suicidal resistance. Most chose submission. City after city sent earth and water to Xerxes, the symbolic gifts of surrender. But in the mountains of Laconia, in the militaristic society of Sparta, King Leonidas made a different choice. Leonidas was not the impossibly muscled warrior king of cinema. He was 60 years old, graying, battle-scarred from decades of warfare. But behind those weathered features burned something that would prove more dangerous than any weapon: the absolute conviction that death was preferable to slavery. Yet here's where our story takes its first dark turn. Leonidas didn't march north with just 300 men. That number, the number that would echo through history, represented only his personal royal guard. So if it wasn't just 300 Spartans, who else was there? The answer lies buried in ancient texts, deliberately obscured by centuries of Spartan propaganda and Hollywood spectacle. But the truth, when you know where to look, is both clear and shocking. Herodotus, the father of history, was there. He spoke to survivors. He recorded what actually happened. And according to his meticulous records, the force that marched to Thermopylae numbered not 300, but over 5,000 men. 5,000. That's more than 16 times the number Hollywood wants you to remember. From the mountainous region of Phocis came 1,000 warriors. The Locrians contributed their entire military force. every fighting man they could muster. But these numbers pale in comparison to two groups whose sacrifice has been almost completely erased from popular memory. The first were 700 men from the small city of Thespiae. Not actors, as their name might suggest to modern ears, but farmers and craftsmen turned soldiers. Men who had never seen a Persian, but who understood that freedom was worth dying for. Every single one of them would die at Thermopylae. Every single one. But their story gets even more remarkable and more heartbreaking. When Leonidas realized the position was hopeless, when a famous betrayal had revealed the mountain path that would surround the Greeks, he gave most of his allies permission to withdraw. The 700 Thespians were given a choice. They could leave. They could return to their families, their farms, their lives. No one would call them cowards. The military situation was impossible. They chose to stay. But the Thespians weren't the only forgotten heroes of Thermopylae. There was another group, 400 men from the powerful city of Thebes. Their story is more complicated, more controversial, and ultimately more tragic than Hollywood could ever imagine. The 400 Thebans present us with one of history's most disturbing moral puzzles. According to some sources, they were hostages, forced to fight to ensure Theban neutrality. According to others, they were volunteers who genuinely believed in the cause of Greek freedom. What we know for certain is this. When the final assault began, when Persian arrows darkened the sky like a biblical plague, when the narrow pass became a charnel house of blood and bronze, the Thebans fought. They fought beside the Spartans. They died beside the Spartans. Persian arrows didn't distinguish between different Greek cities. Persian spears didn't care about political alliances. Yet their sacrifice has been questioned, diminished, almost erased. Why? Because admitting their courage would complicate the narrative. It would make heroes out of men from a city that would later ally with Sparta's enemies. And this brings us to a disturbing truth about how history is written. It's not always the most accurate version that survives. It's the most useful version, the version that serves the political needs of the victors. But the forgotten allies of Thermopylae weren't just from Thespiae and Thebes. As we dig deeper into the archaeological and historical record, an even more complex picture emerges. The Mantineans sent soldiers. The Tegeans marched north. The Orchomenians contributed their share. City after city, tribe after tribe, sent their young men to what everyone knew would be certain death. Each group brought their own fighting traditions, their own equipment, their own reasons for being there. This wasn't a monolithic Spartan force. It was a genuine coalition of Greeks who had decided that some things were worth dying for. But here's what makes their sacrifice even more poignant. Many of these men had never seen the sea. They had never traveled more than a few miles from their villages. Their entire world was a valley, a mountain, a small collection of farms and workshops. Yet when the call came to defend Greek freedom, a concept that was still new and fragile in the ancient world, they left their homes, kissed their wives goodbye, and marched to a pass they had never seen, to fight an enemy they couldn't possibly defeat. This is the true story of Thermopylae, not the tale of 300 superhuman warriors, but the story of over 5,000 ordinary men who chose to become extraordinary. So, why don't we know their names? To understand how the story of thousands became the legend of 300, we need to examine the most efficient propaganda machine in the ancient world, the Spartan military state. Sparta wasn't just a city-state. It was an ideology made manifest. Every aspect of Spartan society was designed for one purpose: creating the ultimate warriors. From birth, Spartan boys were evaluated for military potential. The weak were left to die. The strong were taken from their families and trained for war. This brutal system produced soldiers of legendary skill and discipline. But it also produced something else, an unshakable belief in Spartan superiority. The Spartans didn't just fight battles. They controlled the narrative of battles. They understood something that modern politicians know well. The story that gets remembered is often more important than what actually happened. In the decades and centuries following Thermopylae, as Greece processed the trauma and triumph of the Persian Wars, The Spartan version of events gradually became the accepted version. Their poets, their historians, their politicians all emphasized the same themes: Spartan courage, Spartan discipline, Spartan sacrifice. The contributions of other Greeks were minimized, footnoted, gradually forgotten. It wasn't necessarily malicious, it was just effective. And there were practical reasons for this narrative control. Sparta would spend the next century fighting other Greek city-states. The myth of Spartan invincibility, born at Thermopylae, became a powerful weapon in itself. Who would want to face warriors who had stood against impossible odds and become legends? Who would dare challenge the men who had saved Greece itself? But propaganda, no matter how effective, eventually encounters the stubborn persistence of truth. The real tragedy of Thermopylae isn't what happened during those 3 days in August, 480 BCE. The real tragedy is what happened afterward, how the complexity of human courage was reduced to a simple equation. 300 equals heroism. Modern archaeology has uncovered evidence that supports the ancient written sources. Weapon fragments from multiple Greek regions. Burial sites that suggest a much larger force than 300 men. Physical evidence of the coalition that Hollywood ignored. But perhaps more importantly, we've begun to understand the strategic brilliance of what actually happened at Thermopylae. This wasn't a senseless sacrifice by a small group of warriors. This was a carefully planned, delaying action by a significant military force. The coalition at Thermopylae wasn't trying to stop Xerxes permanently. That would have been impossible. They were buying time. Time for Athens to evacuate its population. Time for the Greek fleet to get into position. Time for the rest of Greece to prepare for what everyone knew was coming. And it worked. The 3 days that Leonidas and his coalition held Thermopylae gave Greece the time it needed to organize the naval victory at Salamis and eventually drive the Persians from Greek soil. This makes the forgotten heroes even more remarkable. They weren't dying in a futile gesture. They were dying as part of a larger plan to save their civilization. But if the historical record is clear, if the archaeological evidence supports it, if the ancient sources document it, why does the myth of just 300 persist so powerfully? The answer lies in the psychology of storytelling. Human beings are naturally drawn to simple, powerful narratives. David versus Goliath. The few against the many. The last stand of heroes who refuse to surrender. 300 is a number small enough to comprehend, large enough to seem significant, and round enough to remember. 5,000 is just a lot of people. It doesn't have the same emotional impact. When Frank Miller created his graphic novel, 300, and when Zack Snyder brought it to the screen, they weren't trying to create historically accurate documentaries. They were tapping into a primal human need for stories of heroic sacrifice. And they succeeded brilliantly. The visual spectacle, the memorable quotes, the stylized violence. It all created a version of Thermopylae that was more emotionally satisfying than the complex historical reality. But at what cost? When we simplify history into mythology, we don't just lose facts. We lose the actual human beings who lived and died for something they believed in. We lose the farmer from Thespiae who left his olive grove to die beside Spartan royalty. We lose the Theban craftsman who proved that courage doesn't belong to any one city or culture. We lose the 1,000 stories of individual choice and sacrifice that made the 300 possible. Standing here at Thermopylae today, you can still feel it. The weight of what happened here. The echo of bronze on bronze. The final cries of men who knew they were dying for something larger than themselves. But if you know the real story, if you understand who is actually here, the battlefield tells a different tale. This wasn't just the grave of 300 Spartans. This was the grave of a coalition. The grave of Greek unity. The grave of men from a dozen different cities who chose to stand together. The monuments here tell part of the story, but they don't tell all of it. They can't capture the complexity of what really happened, the political calculations, the strategic brilliance, the personal courage of forgotten men whose names we'll never know. And maybe that's the most important lesson of Thermopylae. Not that 300 men can change the world, but that thousands of ordinary people, making extraordinary choices can change the world. The 700 Thespians who chose to stay when they could have left. The 400 Thebans who fought regardless of their political situation. The Phocians and Locrians and Mantineans who marched hundreds of miles to defend people they had never met. This is the real legacy of Thermopylae. Not superhuman warriors, but ordinary humans choosing to be heroic. Not genetic superiority, but moral choice. Not the triumph of one culture, but the power of cooperation in the face of tyranny. But perhaps the most disturbing question remains unanswered. In our modern world, where history is increasingly simplified into social media posts and movie plots, how many other forgotten heroes have we erased? How many complex stories of human courage have we reduced to bumper sticker slogans? How many coalitions have we turned into single heroes? How many collective achievements have we attributed to individual genius? The danger isn't just historical inaccuracy, it's moral. When we believe that extraordinary achievements require extraordinary people, we excuse our own inaction. When we mythologize heroes as superhuman, we forget that heroism is actually a choice available to ordinary people. The real warriors of Thermopylae weren't demigods. They were farmers and craftsmen and merchants who decided that some things were worth dying for. They were people like us, facing impossible odds, who chose to stand together. And that choice, the choice to stand together, is still available to us today. So the next time you hear the story of the 300, remember the thousands. Remember the Thespians who chose loyalty over life. Remember the Thebans who proved that heroism transcends politics. Remember the coalition that made the sacrifice possible. Remember that the greatest victories in human history haven't been won by superhuman individuals, but by ordinary people who chose to be extraordinary together. Because the truth that Hollywood ignored, the truth that challenges our need for simple heroes, is also the truth that offers us the greatest hope. We don't need to be perfect. We don't need to be superhuman. We don't need to be Spartan. We just need to choose to stand together. The Battle of Thermopylae ended over 2,500 years ago. But the choice it represents, the choice between comfortable surrender and costly resistance, faces every generation. Today, as we face our own impossible odds, our own overwhelming challenges, our own moments that demand courage, maybe the real question isn't whether we would have stood with the 300. Maybe the question is, who will stand with us?